The air was crisp that evening, carrying the faint scent of rain and the earthy aroma of fallen leaves. I sat alone on the narrow balcony of our apartment, tucked away on a quiet street in Boston. The city hummed in the distance, a low, constant murmur that had become the backdrop to my life. Below, the golden leaves drifted lazily down from the trees, twirling like tiny dancers before settling on the pavement. It should have been a peaceful sight, but peace was the last thing I felt. Regret, guilt, longing, they all pressed on my chest like a physical weight. I wrapped my arms around myself, as if I could hold my unraveling thoughts together. The past year had been a blur of bad choices and buried emotions, each moment cascading into the next, dragging me further away from the life I once knew. Watching the leaves fall, I couldn't help but think of how far I had fallen myself. How had I let things spiral so completely out of control? Andrew and I had built a life together over the past 8 years, a life that once felt solid and unshakable. He was an architect, passionate, talented, and deeply dedicated to his work. I used to admire the way his eyes would light up when he described a project, his hands sketching invisible lines in the air as he spoke. Our days were filled with simple joys, cooking together in our tiny kitchen, hiking in the Berkshires, sharing quiet moments over tea. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was ours. I can still remember the way his laughter used to echo through our apartment, the way he would pull me into a dance when his favorite song played, no matter where we were. A year ago, everything changed. Andrew had started working with Ryan, an ambitious young developer who seemed to embody every quality Andrew lacked: confidence, charm, and an almost reckless drive. At first, their collaboration had been promising, even exciting. Ryan had a way of making the impossible seem attainable, of breathing life into ideas that Andrew had hesitated to pursue. For a while, it felt like Andrew's creativity had been reignited. But it didn't take long for Ryan to show his true colors. He took credit for Andrew's work on a major project, a betrayal that left Andrew professionally disgraced and emotionally gutted. Andrew retreated into himself after that. He spent hours in his studio, sketching plans that would never see the light of day. The man who once filled our home with laughter and warmth became a shadow of himself. I tried to reach him, through words, through actions, through silence, but nothing seemed to break through the wall he had built around himself. I remember sitting beside him one evening, watching the flickering light of a candle on the coffee table, and feeling like I was sitting next to a stranger. Slowly, frustration began to replace my concern, and I found myself withdrawing too. One evening, a friend convinced me to step out of the house, insisting that I needed a break from the heaviness of my routine. She invited me to a small gathering at Ryan's apartment, saying it would be a relaxed evening with tea and conversation. I hesitated at first, but eventually agreed, hoping the change of scenery would help clear my mind. When I arrived, Ryan greeted me with his usual charm, his easy smile disarming me despite myself. His apartment was immaculate, decorated with a mix of modern furniture and personal touches. Framed sketches on the walls, a collection of books neatly arranged on the shelves. He handed me a cup of tea and gestured for me to sit by the window, where the city lights shimmered in the distance. We talked for what felt like hours. He asked me questions about my life, my dreams, my frustrations, things Andrew hadn't asked in months. There was something intoxicating about the way he listened, as if every word I said mattered. I found myself opening up to him in a way I hadn't expected, sharing pieces of myself I thought had been lost in the monotony of my days. At one point, the conversation lulled, and we sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. When I looked up, I found him watching me, his gaze steady and unreadable. "You deserve to feel seen, Martha," he said softly, his voice low and sincere. Before I could respond, he leaned in. His lips brushed mine tentatively, as if giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. The kiss deepened, and for a brief, fleeting moment, the world outside his apartment ceased to exist. All the guilt, the regret, the doubt. It melted away, leaving only the spark of something I hadn't felt in years. When I finally pulled back, the weight of reality came crashing down. I mumbled something about needing to leave and hurried out of the apartment, my heart racing and my thoughts a whirlwind. As I walked home, the spark from that kiss lingered, both thrilling and terrifying me in equal measure. Deep down, I knew I had crossed a line, and there would be no going back. The walk home that evening felt like a journey through another world. The city, usually vibrant and alive, seemed muted, as if the air itself had absorbed the weight of my actions. The streetlights cast long shadows that stretched across the pavement, and each step echoed in the quiet, empty streets. My heart raced, not from exertion, but from the lingering memory of Ryan's kiss, a moment that felt simultaneously like a revelation and a betrayal. When I reached our apartment, the familiar creak of the door and the scent of Andrew's cologne greeted me, grounding me back in the reality I had momentarily escaped. Andrew was in his studio, hunched over his drafting table with a pencil in hand. The dim light accentuated the lines of exhaustion on his face, and for a moment, I felt an overwhelming surge of guilt. How had I let myself stray so far from the man I had promised to stand by? The following days blurred into a strange rhythm of avoidance and pretense. I ignored Ryan's texts and emails, telling myself that distancing from him was the right thing to do. But my resolve faltered when another message arrived. "Martha, I understand if you're upset, but I can't stop thinking about you. I'll be at the restaurant on Berkeley Street tomorrow at 7. I hope you'll come." I read the words over and over, my heart pounding. I knew I shouldn't go, but the pull of seeing him again was impossible to resist. That evening, as Andrew worked late in his studio, I found myself dressing carefully, choosing a navy sweater and a simple necklace. The mirror reflected a woman whose cheeks were flushed, whose eyes betrayed anticipation. The restaurant was dimly lit, its warm ambience a stark contrast to the chilly autumn night outside. When I walked in, I saw Ryan immediately. He was seated near the window, his confident demeanor softened by a hint of nervousness. When he noticed me, his face lit up, and he stood, pulling out the chair for me. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said as I sat down. His voice was low, sincere, and it sent a shiver through me. The conversation began tentatively, but as the evening progressed, the guarded walls I had built started to crumble. Ryan asked about my dreams, my frustrations, and the parts of myself I had buried under years of routine. His attention was intoxicating. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. I found myself laughing, sharing stories and forgetting, if only for a moment, the complexity of my reality. As dessert arrived, a shared plate of tiramisu, our hands brushed while reaching for the same fork. The touch lingered, and when our eyes met, the charged silence spoke louder than any words. He leaned in, his hand lightly resting on mine, and before I could second-guess my actions, I closed the gap between us. The kiss was tender, deliberate, and far more electric than the first. In that moment, the world outside the restaurant seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us. When we finally pulled apart, I saw something in Ryan's eyes that mirrored my own feelings: longing, confusion, and the weight of knowing we had crossed a line we couldn't uncross. The ride home was a blur, my mind racing with emotions that ranged from exhilaration to dread. Back at the apartment, the sight of Andrew's work scattered across the dining table brought the guilt crashing back. How could I reconcile the vibrant, thrilling woman I felt like with Ryan and the dutiful, supportive wife I was supposed to be for Andrew? Sleep eluded me that night as I lay in bed, torn between two lives I had created for myself. The next morning, the first light of dawn streamed through the curtains, but clarity didn't come with it. I knew I couldn't keep walking this line forever, but for now, I was caught in a storm of my own making, unable to let go of either the past or the future I was chasing. The days after my drive with Ryan passed like a dream, one I couldn't quite decide was blissful or haunting. My thoughts drifted between stolen moments with him and the unrelenting silence of my home life. Andrew's studio became his refuge, and I became a shadow, watching him from the edges of a world I could no longer reach. Guilt twisted inside me like a thorny vine, yet I couldn't resist the flicker of warmth that Ryan had reignited. Just as I was beginning to think I couldn't sink any deeper into this web I'd woven, a message arrived from Victor. Victor. He was a name I hadn't thought about in months, perhaps even years. Andrew's best friend since childhood. Victor had been a constant presence in the early days of our marriage. He was the kind of man who could charm anyone with his easy smile and quick wit, but beneath his playful demeanor was a fierce loyalty that had drawn Andrew to him since they were kids. His text was brief but familiar. "Martha, it's been ages. Let's catch up soon. Coffee on me." It felt harmless enough. I told myself it was just a friendly gesture, an overdue reunion with someone who had always been part of our lives. Yet there was a nagging sense of curiosity, a question I couldn't quite articulate. I agreed to meet him at a small cafe near the park, a cozy spot I remembered from years ago when the three of us had laughed over lattes and shared stories of simpler times. When I walked in, Victor stood to greet me, and for a moment, it felt like stepping into the past. His broad shoulders and confident posture were the same, but there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a quiet understanding that made my chest tighten. "Martha," he said warmly, pulling me into a hug that lingered just a second longer than it should have. "You look different. How are you holding up?" The words hit harder than I expected, striking a chord I hadn't realized was so raw. I faltered for a moment, unsure how much to share, but the sincerity in his gaze made it impossible to hide behind pleasantries. "Not as well as I'd like," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Victor nodded, his expression unreadable but kind. "Why don't we sit?" The cafe was quiet, the hum of soft jazz blending with the faint clinking of dishes. We settled into a corner booth, and for the first time in months, I felt seen. Victor didn't bombard me with questions or try to fix anything. He just listened, his hands folded on the table as I stumbled through my words. I told him about Andrew's retreat into himself, how our once vibrant home had turned into a shell of what it used to be. I stopped short of mentioning Ryan, but even without that detail, Victor seemed to understand. "You've been carrying a lot," he said finally, his tone gentle. "You always were strong, Martha. Even when things were hard, you never let it show." A bitter laugh escaped me. Maybe I'm just good at pretending. Victor reached across the table, his hand covering mine. The touch was warm and steady, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in ages. My heart stumbled in my chest as he laced his fingers with mine, his thumb brushing lightly over my skin. "Pretending doesn't make you weak," he said quietly. "It makes you human." The words hung between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he leaned in, his eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. I couldn't move, couldn't think, as his lips met mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as though he was giving me every opportunity to pull away. But when I didn't, it deepened, his hand tightening around mine. The world outside the cafe seemed to vanish, leaving only the two of us in that fragile, fleeting moment. When we finally broke apart, Victor's expression was a mix of longing and regret. "I'm sorry," he murmured, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely. I shook my head, my thoughts a tangled mess. "No, I'm the one who's sorry." We sat in silence for a while after that, the air between us thick with unspoken emotions. Eventually, he walked me to my car, his hand brushing against mine as we said goodbye. That night, as I lay beside Andrew in our bed, his steady breathing filling the room, the weight of my choices pressed down on me like never before. I had kissed 2 men in the span of weeks, neither of whom was my husband. And yet, as shame coursed through me, so did a strange, inexplicable thrill. What was I doing? And how far could I let this go before everything shattered? The following weeks blurred into a haze of stolen moments and fractured emotions. I found myself caught between 2 men, Victor, with his steady warmth and familiarity, and Ryan, whose charm burned like wildfire, leaving me breathless. Victor and I began texting frequently after that night at the cafe. His messages were thoughtful, laced with humor that made me smile in spite of myself. He had a way of reminding me who I was before the weight of everything had pressed me into someone I barely recognized. Ryan, on the other hand, was a whirlwind. He would send cryptic texts at odd hours, "thinking of you" or "wish you were here," always pulling me back into the intoxicating chaos he brought to my life. We met sporadically, sneaking into quiet corners of restaurants or taking long drives where we'd share fevered kisses that left me dizzy. But in the quiet moments at home, the guilt gnawed at me. Andrew remained oblivious, his focus consumed by blueprints and sketches. Sometimes he'd sit at the kitchen table, muttering about design flaws or stubborn clients, and I'd catch glimpses of the man I fell in love with. It made my betrayal cut even deeper. One crisp afternoon, Victor asked if I wanted to meet him in the park. I told myself it was just a walk, just a way to clear my head. But the moment I saw him waiting near the fountain, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat, my heart betrayed me again. "Martha," he said softly as I approached, his smile easing the tension I didn't realize I was holding. "Victor." I tried to sound casual, but the flutter in my chest made it impossible. We walked along the winding paths, the golden leaves crunching beneath our feet. The conversation flowed easily, like it always had with Victor. He told me stories from work, anecdotes about people he'd met, and I found myself laughing in a way I hadn't in months. "You deserve more than this," he said suddenly, his voice serious. I glanced at him, startled. "What do you mean?" "You've been carrying so much, Martha. I see it in your eyes. You're not the same as you used to be." His words hit a nerve I didn't want to acknowledge. "People change, Victor. It's just life." He stopped walking and turned to face me, his gaze unwavering. "But you haven't changed. Not deep down. You're still the same woman who lights up a room without even trying. The same woman who deserves to be loved, not just noticed when it's convenient." My breath hitched as he stepped closer, his hand brushing against my arm. Before I could say anything, he leaned in, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that felt both tender and desperate, as though he was trying to convey everything words couldn't. I let myself get lost in it for a moment, but the guilt surged back with a vengeance. I pulled away, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. "Victor, this is wrong," I whispered, my voice trembling. He looked at me with a mix of longing and understanding. "I know, but it doesn't feel wrong to me." I didn't know what to say, so I turned and walked away, my thoughts swirling in chaos. Later that evening, as I sat at home, Andrew passed me in the hallway without a glance. He didn't ask how my day was, or why my eyes were red. He simply disappeared into his studio, shutting the door behind him. The silence of the house was deafening. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched dinner I'd made, and felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. My husband didn't see me, and yet I was betraying him in ways he couldn't even imagine. My phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Ryan lit up the screen. "Can't stop thinking about you. Dinner tomorrow." I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I stared at the screen, torn between the man who made me feel alive and the one who made me feel whole. How had I let it come to this? And was there even a way to untangle myself without destroying everything in the process? The city lights blurred into a kaleidoscope of colors as I made my way to meet Ryan. Something had shifted inside me. The crushing weight of guilt had transformed into a quiet acceptance of who I had become. Andrew and I were barely more than roommates now. Two people orbiting each other in a space that once held so much love. The realization should have devastated me, but instead, it felt like finally acknowledging a truth I'd been avoiding for months. The restaurant Ryan had chosen was intimate, tucked away in a historic building with exposed brick walls and soft amber lighting. When I walked in, I spotted him immediately at a corner table, his presence commanding even in repose. He stood as I approached, and the way his eyes traveled over me made my skin tingle with anticipation. "You look stunning," he said, pulling out my chair. His fingers brushed against my shoulder as I sat down, a deliberate touch that sent electricity through my body. The waiter appeared with a bottle of wine Ryan had already ordered, a rich red that I recognized as my favorite. Of course he would remember that detail from our conversations. He remembered everything. "To new beginnings," Ryan said, raising his glass. The words hung between us, heavy with promise. As we shared plates of expertly prepared food, our conversation flowed effortlessly. Ryan told me about his latest project, his hands animated as he described his vision for transforming an old warehouse into luxury apartments. I found myself leaning forward, drawn in by his passion and the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his dreams. "What about your dreams, Martha?" he asked, his voice softening. "When was the last time someone asked you about them?" The question caught me off guard. I took a sip of wine, buying time to gather my thoughts. "I used to dream about opening my own gallery," I admitted. "Showcasing local artists, hosting events, creating a space where creativity could flourish. Why didn't you?" "Life happened. Marriage happened. Sometimes we let our dreams slip away so gradually we barely notice they're gone." Ryan reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "They don't have to stay gone." His thumb traced circles on my palm, and I felt the familiar heat building between us. The guilt that had once accompanied these moments was noticeably absent. Instead, there was only desire, pure and uncomplicated. "Dance with me," he said suddenly, standing and extending his hand. I glanced around. "There's no music." He smiled, that confident, knowing smile that never failed to weaken my knees. "We don't need any." I took his hand and let him lead me to a small space near our table. His arm slipped around my waist, pulling me close. The warmth of his body against mine felt right in a way I had stopped questioning. We swayed together, creating our own rhythm in the quiet corner of the restaurant. "You deserve to feel alive," he whispered against my ear. "To feel desired. To feel like the extraordinary woman you are." I pulled back slightly to look at him, seeing the intensity in his gaze. Without hesitation, I pressed my lips to his. The kiss was different from our previous ones. There was no guilt, no reservation, no holding back. His hand tangled in my hair as he deepened the kiss, and I melted into him, finally allowing myself to feel everything I'd been denying. When we broke apart, both slightly breathless, I saw our reflection in the restaurant's window. I looked different, alive, radiant, like a woman who had rediscovered herself. The wedding ring on my finger caught the light, but it felt like a relic from another life, one that had slowly faded into sepia tones while my present burned in vivid color. "Come home with me," Ryan murmured, his forehead resting against mine. For a moment, I thought about Andrew, probably still in his studio, lost in his own world. I thought about our marriage, how it had withered like a plant left too long without water. I thought about the woman I used to be and the woman I had become. "Yes," I said simply, and in that word was liberation. As we left the restaurant, Ryan's hand resting on the small of my back, I realized that sometimes betrayal isn't about breaking promises to others. It's about keeping promises to yourself. I had promised myself, long ago, that I would live a life full of passion and purpose. Somewhere along the way, I had let that promise slip through my fingers. Now, walking through the city streets with Ryan, I was reclaiming it. The night air was crisp with possibility, and for the first time in years, I felt completely, unashamedly alive. Standing before the Ritz-Carlton that afternoon, I felt like I was in a dream. The limestone facade towered above me, elegant and imposing, while my heart thundered in my chest. Room 1504. The numbers Ryan had texted me seemed to pulse in my mind with each step I took down the plush corridor. Before my knuckles could touch the door, it swung open. Ryan stood there, devastating in his tailored suit, and the kiss he pulled me into made the world spin. The room behind him was everything I'd imagined, cream and gold luxury, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the public garden like a painting. A bottle of champagne waited in an ice bucket, crystal flutes standing sentinel beside it. Everything perfect, everything planned. The bed was soft when we sat on its edge, the champagne crisp and cold as it slid down my throat. Ryan's fingers found mine, and that familiar electricity coursed through me. I was lost in the moment, in the heat of his proximity, in the promise of what was to come. Then the knock came. 3 sharp raps that shattered my world. When Ryan opened the door with such calm, such certainty, I felt the first tendril of dread curl around my spine. And then Victor stepped in, and my universe imploded. The champagne glass slipped from my nerveless fingers, the thick carpet swallowing both the glass and the sound. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. Victor and Ryan, together in the same room, looking at me with mirror expressions of gentle concern. The truth spilled out between them like poison. They'd known each other for years, had discovered their shared connection to me through casual conversation. What had started as anger between them had transformed into some twisted experiment. They'd been watching me, waiting for me to choose, as if my heart was a game they could play. The city sprawled below us through those massive windows, millions of lives continuing while mine crumbled around me. Every kiss, every tender moment, every whispered promise, all of it took on a new, tainted meaning. They'd orchestrated this elaborate dance, waiting to see which way I would turn, which man would ultimately claim my heart. And Andrew, my husband's name echoed in my mind like a distant bell. He remained oblivious, lost in his architectural drawings and professional disappointments, while I'd been caught in this web of deception. The irony of it all threatened to choke me. I couldn't bear to stay in that room another moment, couldn't stand the weight of their combined gaze. My escape was a blur, grabbing my purse, forcing my legs to carry me to the door. Their presence behind me felt like a physical pressure, but I couldn't look back. I couldn't face what I'd see in their eyes. The elevator descent was eternal, each floor ticking by like years. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and my reflection in the polished doors showed a woman I barely recognized. Who had I become? The safe harbor of Victor's understanding, the passionate adventure of Ryan's devotion, the familiar comfort of my marriage to Andrew. All of it swirled together in my mind like watercolors bleeding into each other. Emerging onto the Boston streets felt like breaking through the surface of deep water. The autumn air was sharp in my lungs, the late afternoon sun painting everything in shades of gold. People rushed past me, wrapped up in their own stories, their own dramas, while I stood frozen on the sidewalk, untethered from everything I thought I knew. The future stretched before me like an unmarked path, full of possibilities and pitfalls. There was no going back to the woman I was before, no undoing the choices I'd made. The only way was forward, into uncertainty. I had no idea where the story would lead me, what ending waited around the next corner. The only thing I knew for certain was that nothing would ever be the same again. My life had become a story I no longer recognized, with an ending I couldn't predict. And somewhere in that luxury hotel room, two men waited to see which way my heart would turn, while at home, my husband continued to live in his world of blueprints and missed opportunities. I stood at the crossroads of all these lives, these possibilities, these potential futures, and for the first time in my life, I had no idea which path to take.